Good morning and welcome to RDA's conclusion of our four-part webinar series centered around SharePoint 2013. Today's topic is Securing SharePoint 2013. I'd like to introduce our series speaker, Pablo Gazmiri. And as a principal architect with RDA, Pablo has led SharePoint efforts for a number of Fortune 500 companies. His SharePoint expertise includes system architecture, governance, custom solutions, planning, mentoring, and training. With 15 years of development experience, Pablo is a web collaboration and search expert who has built numerous corporate intranets, extranets, e-commerce sites, and custom applications over the course of his career. He has recently assisted clients with build-outs of SharePoint 2013 portals and collaboration environments and currently leads RDA's SharePoint 2013 migration offering. Pablo, thanks for joining us again today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Patty. So today we're going to talk about securing SharePoint 2013 from the bottom of the stack all the way to the top. So we'll talk about everything from server configuration all the way to end user security and maybe how to protect your site from being used as a platform for other attacks. Before we get started, I'd like to start with a quick poll. For those of you who are joined in, please go ahead and answer this question for us. Does your company host a SharePoint farm accessible from the internet? And if you do users have to log in, or is there anonymous access to that site? It looks like there's about 23 of us on the line right now, so hopefully we can get enough of you to answer here. So it looks like most of you do have a SharePoint site accessible from the internet, but it's not accessible unless you have a login, which is good because that certainly helps restrict your security, or helps enhance your security and restrict the attack surface of your website. For those of you who don't know, maybe you do. So today we'll start by talking about a few definitions about what really is security, what is secure versus not secure, and what that looks like. And then, like I said, we'll talk about everything from farm configuration, network configuration, internal security, and admin security, as well as on the front end, how you secure your sites, specifically public-facing sites, and then some common issues that we've seen. And if we have time, I'll talk about social engineering as well. So let's get started. First, a few definitions. I was giving a presentation in Atlanta last year, and someone mentioned to me that, well, if I host my public-facing site on the same farm as my internal collaboration site, isn't that insecure? And my response was, well, it really depends on your definition of what is insecure. And in the web security world, a system can be insecure or it can be less secure. So a lot of things that we talk about when it comes to security are exploits. These are specific bugs in software or misconfigurations in software that somebody can use to actively bypass some security measure. That exploit is really it's a bug. It needs to be fixed, and it's something that I would say makes a system insecure. But there are a lot of configurations that fall under the realm of defense in depth. And when we talk about defense in depth, we're talking about creating a more secure configuration or more secure software that is really in place to prevent, just in case a new exploit is discovered, to prevent further damage from being done. So we'll talk a lot about things that are defense in depth in today's webinar. There's also a matter of internal security, protecting against threats that are inside your network, whether they're users, actually corporate users, or if perhaps you have physical security issues with your network. Anybody can potentially connect to your Wi-Fi network if they crack your password, or if they happen to find out the password. And are you protected if somebody internally can get at your systems? And that might be different than, say, on the public-facing internet. So you also have a number of administrators. Perhaps you have vendors or consultants who have access to your farm. And are you giving them access to the farm in a secure way? We'll talk about that. So key here is, just because you haven't implemented every security best practice or you haven't separated every site onto a different farm doesn't mean that it's insecure. It just means that it might be less secure than it could be. So let's talk about farm configuration. Typically, we have anywhere from 5 to 15 service accounts assigned at any given SharePoint farm. So these accounts are the accounts that the different services run under. There's a reason why we have many. In some configurations, you might see the same account shared by many services. And that's okay. It's not explicitly unsecure, but it's not as secure as it could be. So, for example, your search crawl account will have access potentially to internal file shares to be able to crawl that data. If somebody finds a way to exploit the search service and use that account, or exploit, for example, your web application service, you don't want it running under the same privileges as your search crawl account, because then someone who's exploited that service could then go and access those file shares or whatever other items are accessible by that account. So by giving each service the minimum amount of privileges that it's required to do its job, we protect against exploits and we limit the damage that's possible if somebody does manage to exploit a particular service. Something that typically we don't see implemented, but really is the best practice, is to implement automatic password changes. By having your services automatically change their passwords in a regular interval, your administrators, consultants, people working on the system, they don't actually end up knowing those service account passwords, which means they can't then use those service accounts to do things that they might not be able to do with their personal accounts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to admin configuration or admin security. Definitely want to turn off any unused services. Again, each service that exposes some kind of functionality is also a potential exploit. It's possible to find a way to use that service to do something it wasn't intended. And even in systems where we don't know of any particular exploits for a given system, and certainly, if you're patched up properly, there shouldn't be, someone could discover a new exploit at any time. And so we want to limit our vulnerability by reducing our attack surface area by turning off any unused services. And this also applies to particular URLs on our web applications, and we'll show that in a little bit. Definitely want to isolate your web applications and the data they can access. So, for example, if you are hosting multiple web applications on a single SharePoint farm, ideally all those applications will run under different identities that only have access to the data for the particular web application that they're running. And again, that comes down to, if a web application is exploited, you're not going to be able to go and read data out of a different web application. So there's definitely important to do that. Same thing with isolating your search service applications, BDC, and profile services. So again, if you're running an internal collaboration site on your farm as well as a public-facing site, you're going to want to make sure that you use different search service applications for those sites, so that I can't potentially search your internal collaboration space from your public-facing websites. Same thing with if you're bringing in line of business data through the business data catalog or business connectivity services, you want to make sure that that same service isn't available to your public-facing website. From a network perspective, there's a number of different topologies that you can use to protect your SharePoint farm. For those of you who are just using SharePoint internally, you typically just run the SharePoint inside of your corporate network. Many of you who are trying to expose it publicly have a few options. You can put the servers in the DMZ, so they're not directly connected to your internal network except for through a firewall, and are typically only available through either port 80 or port 43 for HTTP access to the farm itself. You can also use an authenticated reverse proxy, such as the Unified Access Gateway, Threat Management Gateway available through Microsoft, which unfortunately is being deprecated, but there are other solutions that do the same thing. The nice thing about using an authenticated reverse proxy is that a user from the wider internet, when they hit your SharePoint farm, they're not going to be able to even request data from it until they authenticate to the proxy. So essentially, they have to log in through the load balancer before they can even access the SharePoint site, which is a nice way to protect yourself, because at that point, if there was ever any exploit discovered for the way that SharePoint handles logins, end users wouldn't even be able to exploit that. They'd have to exploit the load balancer first. There are also what we call split topologies, where we divide up the SharePoint servers into different sections of the network. So you might have your web front-end servers in the DMZ, but your app servers in the corporate network. And perhaps this is so that those app servers could crawl file shares or access network resources for integration purposes or for reporting service purposes, but your web front ends wouldn't have access to those items, and they could only talk to the app servers directly through the firewall. So you can split up your SharePoint farms in different ways to provide more security or more functionality. And then, of course, the cloud is a great option if you want to completely isolate a SharePoint farm from your corporate environment. Host it in the cloud instead, and that way, if that farm is ever exploited, there's no danger that anybody might be able to access your internal corporate network through that farm. From an admin perspective, one of the biggest problems that I see with clients' SharePoint environments is that everybody's logging in with the farm account. And this is generally a bad idea, mostly because you can't audit who's made changes, who's logging into the system. A lot of times, if you don't have automatic password changes in play, a consultant might be given that farm account password, and then 6 months later or a year later, they're still able to access the system, even though they're no longer engaged with the client. So certainly, you might have ex-employees that you don't want to give access to, and then you've got to change the farm account password, which on its own, if you do it manually, can cause some problems and introduce some downtime. So typically, you want to grant your admins the permissions that they need on all the systems to do what they need to do with their own accounts or with their own admin accounts, which can be tricky, which is why a lot of you probably don't do it already. My recommendation there is to take the time to understand exactly what privileges are needed and to get those configured for your admin so that they can use their own personal accounts. From a site level and a SharePoint data perspective, you also want to audit the event log for site collection administrator and web app policy changes. So as a SharePoint farm administrator, I don't necessarily have access to all of the individual site collections. I can certainly grant myself that access through central admin, but there is an event log entry that's created when I do that. So if you want to have a really tight security policy, you might not grant your admins access to specific sites and then request when they do really need to get in there and make a change or help somebody out, they could do so by granting themselves those privileges and then revoking those privileges later, and that's all auditable in the event log. From a site perspective, I'm sure many of you know, security can be tricky in SharePoint in terms of there are many different settings, and we have everything from user roles or groups, we have permission levels, and we have items that we're securing. And it's not uncommon that, especially in very large site collections, you break inheritance all over the place, and you create different groups perhaps for sub-sites or even for particular libraries to manage those things. Well, a couple of tips here. Number one, you definitely want to always secure items using groups. Don't assign end users direct privileges to anything, whether it's a document library, a site, or a site collection itself. You also really don't want to have so many security groups in one site collection. If you have 3 security groups for every site and you've got 100 sites in a site collection, that means that you have 300 security groups that are all managed at the site level. So all of those security groups will show up in one place. It can be very difficult to go through, manage them, and then audit who has access to what. The same thing is true of having broken permission inheritance throughout a site collection. It can be very difficult to manage and audit. So for this reason, I definitely recommend that you use many site collections instead of one large site collection, and typically you divide up site collections according to security needs. So if you have one group that needs to own a particular site and manage a particular site that's different from the group that might need to own or manage, say, the parent site or a sibling site, you would create that site as its own site collection. And then when it comes to global granting or restricting of permissions across an entire web application, you can do that using what's called a web application policy in central admin. So you go to manage your web applications, and there's a button there called a web application policy or user policy. And from there, you can grant access or deny access to any particular AD group or Active Directory user to the entire web application. Note that at the web app level is the only place in SharePoint where you can explicitly deny access to a resource. Everywhere else at the site collection, site level, you're only ever granting access at any particular point. There's no ability to say give access to everybody in this group except for John. You need to explicitly add everybody but John to that security group. And that's called positive security or additive security. It's similar to a whitelist, which is always much more secure than using a blacklist, because once you start to deny any particular users, that doesn't guarantee that other users don't show up in a group, for example, that hasn't been denied, and they automatically will start to get privileges. So it can be very difficult to manage that. So luckily, SharePoint helps us there, but you do need to have a fairly consistent scheme for how you're going to secure your sites, and ideally restrict the number of groups if possible, and break up your site collections as much as possible. For public-facing sites, I think this is really the biggest attack area on your farm is if you have a public-facing site. So as I mentioned before, using a reverse proxy is a really great way to secure your farm on the front end. For those of you who might have an anonymous access to your SharePoint sites, you definitely need to enable what's called the View Form Pages Lockdown feature. And this prevents anonymous users from being able to view settings, people, content, even submit data to lists. So this is a great way to start by preventing anonymous users access to parts of the system they shouldn't have access to. Now, once people are logged in, that feature no longer applies, and you're going to need to make sure that they still, at that point, do not have access to things they shouldn't have access to. So we definitely want to lock down unnecessary services. We can do that using the web config. We can also write, a custom HTTP module to scan incoming requests and make sure that they're authorized. And you definitely don't want to ever grant SharePoint logins to end users automatically. So if you have a join our site or become a member, and someone can go in and submit a request that's automatically granted to get themselves a login to your site, they'll then have bypassed the forms lockdown feature and potentially can get in and see more information than you might expect. They could, for example, browse the people list and see all the members of your site, or go through and find content and see the names of content owners, maybe where they shouldn't. And finally, with public-facing sites, you definitely need to consider your network topology very carefully. As I mentioned, with using a reverse proxy, potentially using the DMZ, much more important for a public-facing site. You also need to be sure that your SharePoint site isn't a platform for attacks on other sites. So, for example, unsecured email forms or services, perhaps where you allow people to share an article from your site or some piece of content, if you don't put a CAPTCHA there or you don't require someone to be logged in, then spammers and phishers can find that service and send mail through it. Unvalidated redirects basically refers to when you have a page that takes a URL, perhaps as a query string variable, and redirects to that other page. And typically, redirect pages are common for a number of different scenarios, say for login pages, or when sending links via email that might need to be tracked before they are then redirected to the final piece of content. If you don't validate those redirects, if you don't make sure that the place you're redirecting someone to is back on your site and for a legitimate purpose, then phishers, basically people scamming, sending out fake emails that look like they come from your website, can then create a URL that points back to your website, but then instantly redirects back to a fake website, or basically where the scammer is going to try to then collect some information. So you want to make sure that you don't have any unvalidated redirects. And finally, output that isn't HTML encoded can allow phishers to place content or code on your site. So scammers basically can update your site or make your site look different or add content to a page on your site that you didn't intend to be there, either by passing it through a query string variable or by submitting some data that then maybe shows up on a public profile page, and then you can send a link to that profile page to somebody, and it can display sort of whatever they want. I've seen this happen. So, typically when we work with clients, it's not uncommon to find security issues, and a lot of times where we see the most security issues is with custom code. It can be very difficult, or rather, it can be very easy to introduce a security bug or exploitable code in custom code, especially if you don't have the experience to understand all the potential attack vectors that are available. So, especially when it comes to your account-related code. So any code that interacts with end-user accounts is something you're going to want to audit very carefully. When it comes to create account code, forget password, or change password code, it's not uncommon to find really obvious insecure features of this stuff that allows you to take over other people's accounts. And once you can take over somebody else's account, you can potentially find personal information about them or get access to things that you shouldn't have access to. And then, of course, anywhere where your custom code accepts any sort of input, you need to watch for basic injection attacks. So an injection attack is where somebody adds some piece of code to your input that is then run through some kind of a back-end query. So most common is a SQL injection, where a little bit of SQL is actually inputted into a form and submitted, and the back-end system goes to save that data to a database and passes it right through without scrubbing it. At that point, that SQL can be executed on the database. So someone could potentially request data they shouldn't have access to, or tamper with your system, start deleting tables and things. You also have the issue of cross-site scripting. So, one example was we had a client who was running a contest online and allowed people to create their own usernames and upload photos. And a hacker basically created a username that was a link back to an image and some JavaScript. And when you went to his profile page, that JavaScript would run on the page, and you would see a large image on the page that said, hacked by Anonymous or whatever it was. So you need to be careful about always scrubbing your data input. And this can be harder than it looks. There's a lot of ways to inject HTML that a browser would read and accept and run as script that you might not realize. There's ways of injecting Unicode characters, lots of different ways of escaping values and things. So you need to be careful with that. There's a library out there called Google Kaja, K-A-J-A, that you can use to actually help scrub. You also want to carefully audit any change to code. So anytime there's a change to forgot password, change password, or create account code especially, you want to actually make sure that change is reviewed carefully and not just put in without any additional eyes on it. You also can have some improper security settings. So you definitely will want to test if logged in users can access things like your site members list, your search service, your people picker. There's so much functionality in SharePoint that might be exploitable or could be used to access information that really shouldn't be available, that it can be hard to plug all those holes. There are plenty of sites online that will help you work through all of the particular URLs and things that you should block, but there are quite a few of them. Again, that view form pages lockdown is really important to have enabled, and we'll show why in a demo in a minute. And then you can also have services themselves that are insecure. You also want to make sure that your software is patched from the OS, IIS, ASP.NET, and SharePoint itself level, as well as any third-party software. There's actually some security scanning tools you can run to find out if your OS needs to be patched or is missing any important security hotfixes. Basically, every once in a while, someone discovers a new exploit, a new way to use a service or a piece of software or URL for something that wasn't intended. And the only way to resolve that is to patch the software, is to fix the exploit that's making your system insecure. So some things that I've personally seen many times, we see a lot of security issues. And in my career, I've seen many more than this, but just on top of my mind when I was creating this presentation, I wanted to mention a few things that I had seen just to give you an idea of the wide variety of problems that can be introduced, especially with custom code. So in one case, I found a password reset page that only required a username or their ID to access. So I literally could pull up the password, the change password page, and there was a query string at the top for my URL, and I changed the ID from 101 to 102, and all of a sudden someone else's username shows up on the screen, and I can change their password right from there. Not an uncommon issue. And that's an example where a programmer was using security by obscurity. They thought, well, no one really is going to look at the query string or know what they're looking at, so this is fine. But it's really not. An experienced programmer is going to look at that and know exactly what it is and be able to potentially break into your system using that exploit. I found a custom service once that would execute any COM or COM plus function that was passed to it, along with any parameters passed to the service. So you could, in theory, execute any COM function on that system. And when we talk about defense in depth, that system was running under a service account that happened to have full admin privileges on the box. So that's one example where you really want to make sure that your service accounts aren't used as farm admins they don't have admin access to the box themselves. And by default, SharePoint only requires you to create an account that has no privileges whatsoever. And when you assign that account to run for a particular web application, SharePoint will automatically give it just the privileges it needs. So another example where you do not want to run, with a single service account across your entire farm. I ran across a create account page that didn't validate whether an account had already existed. I've also run across these pages where they only validate on the client side. So if I were to submit a web request using a custom tool or by manipulating the web request using something like Fiddler, I could submit any username to that create account page, and the result would be that whatever password I submitted would become that new user's password, or that existing user's password, and I could then take over the account. As I mentioned before, we had output of a username to a page that was not HTML encoded. I've been in situations multiple times where help desk did not verify an identity before resetting the password. So I called up help desk and I said, well, this is my account and I'm locked out. Can you reset my password? And they would just reset it and tell me the new password over the phone. We'll talk a little bit about social engineering, and that's most likely going to be your biggest security issue if somebody specifically wants to target your organization. And then finally, there's a lot of sites where people have built custom CMSs that basically read a file passed via query string variable. So in the URL itself, you would see the name of a file that when you requested that page with a particular file name in the URL, it would then read back that file. And in this case, I was able to pull the password file off the server and see it right there in my web browser. So again, there's two issues there. One, there's an exploit in the software that allows me to get content I shouldn't be able to see. And two, the service account running that web application had access to something it probably shouldn't have, which was the password file on the system. So for my next demonstration, I will now hack into a SharePoint site. Just kidding. I really can't do that. If I were to do that on a webinar, I think it would be pretty irresponsible. This is not supposed to be a demonstration or training on how to hack into a SharePoint site so much as how to secure it. But I will try to find some content that maybe I shouldn't see. So let me switch to Internet Explorer here. I have Google up, and I'm just going to do a very simple search to find potentially insecure SharePoint environments. This search is going to be for all site content. As you may know, being a SharePoint user, there's a common page in use called All Site Content in SharePoint that allows you to browse all the content in a SharePoint site. As an anonymous user, I really shouldn't be able to see all of the back-end content of a website. And there might be files that are being collaborated on here, not directly linked on the site itself. Here's a Navy site, but I'm not going to click on that link. Got Tennessee Health Department. I can view their documents here. I'm not sure if I should be able to see that. I can see usernames now. Now I have a username I can try to log into the system with. So just exposing this one piece of functionality, and we can see this is the page, layouts, view lists. Just by exposing that, I now have access to information I probably shouldn't. I'm going to close this. Let me go back to Air Force Magazine. This is a client of ours. We built a site for them. It is secure. If I try to access that same all-site content page here, I'm going to get hit with a login. And that's because we turned on the View Form Pages Lockdown feature. And when people actually log into this site, they don't log into SharePoint itself. We set a cookie and we manage that internally so that they actually never bypass that View Form Pages Lockdown, and it keeps the system very secure. So that's it for a demo. I can't really show much more than that. Just want to make it clear that there are a lot of sites that are insecure. I mean, I can go down to page 10 and still be going through sites. And all of these sites now, if I was looking to take over a system or just find a system to exploit, this would be very easy to do. So you want to be really careful about how you expose your data to the Internet. So I want to talk a little bit about social engineering. The demonstration I just showed will allow somebody to find a system that's exploitable and then to start attacking those systems. but it's not necessarily going to help them attack somebody very specific. If somebody's going after your organization, chances are they're going to start with some kind of a social engineering exploit. Kevin Mitnick is a hacker who is, I think he actually spent some time in prison, and now he's a security expert that helps companies, really lock down their systems and make sure they're secure. And he says it's much easier to trick someone into giving a password than it is to spend the effort to crack into the system. And that's definitely true. Security researchers have found that many users will actually give up their passwords for a candy bar. We'll talk a little bit more about what these exploits look like. So when it comes to social engineering, there's a lot of different ways that people can be tricked. Certainly we have, classic phishing, which is where someone sends you an email that looks like it came from a legitimate place. Like maybe it looks like it came from your bank, and it tells you, well, there's an urgent message, and click here. And you click there, and you don't check the URL, and it takes you to some, weird site somewhere. But if you're not looking at the URL bar in your browser, you see something that looks just like your bank website, and you type in your login information without thinking about it. And at that point, the scammers have your bank login and password and can log in as you and change your address and email new checks to themselves and basically take your money. So phishing is very common. You've probably all gotten phishing emails at some point, and they can be very, very crafty. This is also why you have something called site key. For those of you who log into online banking and you see the same picture every time, that's there to guarantee that that site is actually the bank website. And so if you do ever get an email from your bank and you click to log in and you don't see that site key image, do not enter your username and password. Pretexting is just a fancy word for basically lying. So people will call up with some kind of a pretext and say, this is network security. We found a problem on your PC. We're going to need your password to continue, and then the person will give up that password. Diversion is anytime you take control of where somebody thinks they're going and divert them somewhere else. So it's kind of like phishing, and actually there's a scam in Las Vegas at one point where locksmiths were being diverted, their phone calls were being diverted to one particular locksmith who was then getting all the business because someone had hacked into the phone system. IVR phishing is interactive voice response phishing. So these are automatic phone systems, kind of like the prompts that you get when you call your bank, only they'll call you, and they'll say that maybe it's your bank calling, and we have some secure information for you, and would you please enter your PIN number to continue to verify? Would you please enter your Social Security number to continue? And people, of course, they hear an automated system with dial tones and things, and they think that, well, this must be the bank, right? This isn't just some scammer. In fact, it can be. So never give out your information to anybody who calls you. Only if you call the bank do you give out your information. There's also baiting, which is really just sort of giving somebody some kind of a lure to give you information, whether it's a candy bar for your password or something similar. Quid pro quo is, hey, I'll do you a solid, you do me a solid. I won't tell anybody, just give me the admin password. And then commonly we see exploiting of current events. So, for example, we recently had some plane crashes around the world. You might get an email or a phone call that says, hey, we're collecting donations for victims of this plane crash. Would you like to include a $10 donation through payroll? Great. Just give me your Social Security number and your password so we can confirm. And someone thinks they're doing something good for others, and really they're just being exploited by a scammer. So how do we protect against this? It's really important to establish some kind of a framework of trust. This really works with your help desk and your admin personnel to make sure that whenever they give out information or whenever they request information, certain procedures are in place. You definitely want to understand where your sensitive information is stored, who has access to it, and what rules are laid out for them to give anybody else access to it or to read some of that information out, and then establish those security protocols. Then you've got to train people in them. You've really got to make your users understand that no one will ever ask for their password if it's the IT help desk or any other group. They will never be required to write it down or to speak it over the phone. And that generally should be, also enforced in terms of how you do your work. If you establish a procedure that requires someone to give out their password on the phone, that's a problem. And then, of course, you need to secretly test that framework and make sure that it's actually working. So from RDA's perspective, we do offer a SharePoint security audit. We will provide an architect to go through and review your network configuration, your server configuration, make sure that all unnecessary services are turned on, your farm configuration, especially in regards to how your service accounts are configured. Do you have the right level of isolation of these service accounts between services? Do you have automatic password change enabled? And from a topology perspective, is your farm as secure as it can be? And many times we choose a less secure configuration to enable certain functionality, and that's okay. We'll call that out. We'll let you know, and you can decide how to proceed. We'll also look down to the site level to see, do you have broken permission inheritance everywhere? Do you have a way of auditing and figuring out who has access to what? And then, of course, we'll also look through any custom code. So obviously, depending on the complexity of your farm and the sites that you have, this engagement could go anywhere from just a few days to a couple of weeks. And, of course, at the end, we'll provide a detailed write-up with any recommendations about how to make sure that your farm could be more secure. So if you're interested in that, definitely contact your RDA sales rep or give me a call directly. So about RDA, we like to approach IT, we like to tackle business problems with IT resources. If you have a business problem, we can help you figure out how to engineer a solution to meet your needs. And we do it with high value and low risk. From an IT perspective, if you have IT problems, we can also help you, obviously. We focus in custom application development, generally in .NET, but we also do some open source and third parties, SharePoint, business intelligence, cloud, and mobile apps. So any questions? I know we covered at a high level a lot of different areas. I didn't get into too much detail anywhere because we don't have too much time here. But any general questions about security and SharePoint, or really any SharePoint questions?
Yep. Pablo, we actually do have a few that came in. And again, I'll just offer that if anybody does have questions, you can ask it live by dialing *6 to unmute your line, or you can, again, use the Q&A interface like some folks have been doing. So our first question is, we have separate departmental team sites set up all under one site collection. Do you suggest we create different site collections for each departmental site?
Absolutely, I do. In general, it's easier to create each department in its own site collection so they have their own security envelopes. And so, for example, at the top level, you're not going to see a whole bunch of groups for individual departments in SharePoint. You're just going to see security for the top level site. And then when you get down into a particular department, perhaps it's HR, that content's going to be owned by a different group. And so it's easier to give that group its own site collection with its own isolated security model. Also, if you do give your site owners site collection admin privileges to do a lot more than just a site owner would be able to do in terms of configuring things like audit settings and policies, you definitely want to break out into separate site collections because that security can only be granted at the top level. So definitely recommend different site collections for each departmental site.
All right, and next question would be, what are some patching, checking software for SharePoint?
So there's a tool called the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, and this isn't for SharePoint itself. This is for the entire base of the operating system, IIS and ASP.NET. It will basically check to make sure that you have all of your, including SharePoint, all of any necessary security hotfixes and patches on your service. It'll tell you what you're missing so that you don't have any exploitable software on your system. One other thing I'll mention is that if you are doing any custom coding, actually any ASP.NET custom coding, there's a tool called cat.net, that's CAT.net, and that will actually scan your .NET assemblies for all kinds of web security issues like unfiltered input, unscrubbed input, SQL injection attacks, things like that. And then for SharePoint itself, There's nothing specific to SharePoint, like I said, but certainly I would recommend that if you aren't patched to the latest service pack, that you definitely want to do that as soon as possible.
All right. Our next question is, I've been told that changing passwords on service accounts will break SharePoint. We typically have non-expiring passwords on all our service accounts. Is there a better way?
So absolutely. And if you do just change the password on your service account, you will break SharePoint. SharePoint actually has a mechanism in Central Admin. You can configure automatic password changes. And what that means is that SharePoint itself will actually use those accounts to change their own password. And so SharePoint can manage that entire process for you. So you just turn that on in settings in Central Admin. You can look it up on the web, or if you have any questions about where that is, just send me an email, and I'll let you know how to find that. But you can configure SharePoint to change its own accounts so that no one really knows the password. SharePoint does, but that's it. And you certainly could extract those passwords from SharePoint if you really needed to, but fundamentally it's a lot more secure. And then you won't break SharePoint because SharePoint knows exactly when that password changed and will immediately log in with the new password. So that's definitely a better way. One other thing I'll mention is if you do have a policy that locks out your accounts after so many invalid attempts, the reason for that policy on a domain is typically so that somebody can't just try many different password combinations until they find the right password. They're going to get locked out after 3 times or 5 times of entering the wrong password, and they're not going to be able to continue trying to break that, right? Well, with a service account in SharePoint, you typically don't want to do that because then somebody can really try to, anybody can lock out those accounts and prevent them from being used. So if I know what the name of your SharePoint Farm account is or your SharePoint Web Application Service account, I could then just attempt to log in a few times with that, and I shut down SharePoint. And I don't need to have any special rights to do that. So typically you don't want your accounts to automatically lock out, and certainly you do not want to have accounts that expire or that must have their passwords changed if you don't implement automatic password change, because then those accounts, they will break at some point, and you'll have to go in and fix that. So again, if you implement automatic password change from SharePoint, that'll be the most secure you can be.
All right, and I don't think you covered this in your answer because it's around passwords as well. So the question is, if the password is automatically changed, how can an admin configure, let's say, the user profile sync, which requires the farm account and password to activate?
Right, so you should be able to grant your admin the rights that they need to activate that without using the farm account itself. I'm not sure exactly what permissions those are off the top of my head, but certainly you shouldn't have to have the farm account password to do that. At the same time, you can extract that password from SharePoint. So on a limited basis, if somebody wants to go in and work under that account, or typically there's an install account that's different from the farm account that might have those privileges, and you would do it that way.
All right, one more question. Our service accounts are created by our enterprise group, I believe via Active Directory. If we use, I lost track there. If we use auto password change, would that require updating Active Directory from SharePoint?
When you do automatic password changing from SharePoint, it is changing Active Directory. So the same way where you can change your password on your Windows desktop, the SharePoint system would change its Active Directory password and, of course, the local record of that password all in one shot. So that's actually what SharePoint is doing, is updating Active Directory when it changes the password.
And let's see. Another question, what kind of effort does it usually take to secure a site that has security problems?
So typically it takes a little bit more time usually to find the problem. Obviously there are a lot of different ways you can go at sort of attacking a SharePoint site and getting into it. So usually, especially for some kind of a public-facing site with a lot of different functionality, it might take you a few weeks just to find the problem. Especially if you know you've been exploited in some way and aren't sure, then you need to spend the time to really find it. But actually fixing most of these problems is very straightforward. Typically, if you have an unsecured service of some kind, you can update your web config to prevent access to that service. And if, for example, if you need access to that service to do editing or site management, you can extend the web application to an internal zone and not make that extended web application available to the public, but make it available internally so you can go in and make your edits and access those services while the original web application secured with the web config prevents any access to those services, and it's all pointing to the same content. So and generally from a code perspective, if you have exploit in code, say, like I mentioned before, the password change, it really doesn't take very much. You're talking about a day or two of work to actually, update that code, change that code, review the settings. You might spend more time testing it than you did making the change itself. But usually these fixes are very quick and very straightforward because there's usually a very distinct problem that is making your system insecure, and it typically isn't an issue with the entire architecture of your site. Usually there's just a few places here or there that you need to check.
Great. Well, thank you, Pablo. That's all the questions we have and pretty much the time that we have. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We did put up the slide. In case you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out either to Pablo or to our marketing group. Please visit our website for any additional details you may need. And that concludes our session for today. So thank you and have a great rest of the day.